We also have a very robust collection of oral histories and archives, the Jewish Merchant Project, digital cemetery records, and a fabulous biannual publication. Please join us at jhssc.org or visit our Facebook page. Collaborating with us on this program, we have two additional sponsors. The William Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum, which is a preeminent center for Jewish culture in the Southeast, bringing people of all backgrounds together and understanding of appreciation of Jewish history, culture, and the arts. The museum, which is located in Midtown Atlanta, houses, as part of the Lillian and A.J. Weinberg Center for Holocaust Education, a permanent Holocaust exhibit, as well as gallery and auditorium spaces hosting a range of other exhibits and performances. While their doors are closed at this time, their work has not stopped, and they're developing online and virtual programming in support of their mission. The Southern Jewish Historical Society has existed continuously since 1977. This organization hosts an annual conference, academic journal, and active grant and award programs. The SJHS has been at the forefront of new scholarship about Jewish South for the last 49 years. Due to the pandemic, we had to cancel this year's October conference, which was going to be held together with us, the Jewish Historical Society. But they're very pleased to be involved in this programming, and for more information, visit thejewishsouth.org. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and will be available later this week on our Facebook page. In order to limit interruptions, we will place you all on mute during this presentation. Check in the bottom left-hand corner and make sure that you are muted. We do welcome questions through the chat forum and the feature which is at the bottom of your screen. Send them to our Executive Director, Rachel Barnett, who will be compiling the questions during the presentation, and will consolidate the questions and share them with the speakers at the end. Most of the photos in this power presentation today have come from the special collections at the College of Charleston. Now, I would like to first introduce our new Executive Director. That's Rachel Barnett. Rachel, wave so everybody can see where you are. Rachel accepted this position just this month, and she is a seasoned member of the Society, having served as its president. Okay, now I'm hearing a feedback, so somebody needs to be sure that you're on mute. But she's served as president and then as program director for the last 8 years. She was the architect of the Jewish Merchant Project and implemented the fabulous exhibit, A Store at Every Crossroads. She has 30 years of experience in event planning, PR, marketing, and fundraising, both in the nonprofit and business arena. Now, to our two wonderful presenters who are well known in the South Carolina community and especially in Charleston. But for those of you who may not know them, let me introduce Richard Mark Gergel, a sitting United States District Judge in Charleston, South Carolina. He is a native of Columbia and is a graduate of Duke University and the Duke University School of Law. He is a former president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina and is the co-author with his wife, Dr. Belinda Gergel, of In Search of the Tree of Life, The History of Early Jews in Columbia, South Carolina. His most recent work, Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, and the Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Wallace Waring, has been critically acclaimed by the New York Times and Washington Post, and is the subject of an upcoming PBS documentary. Robert Rosen was born and raised in Charleston. He is an attorney and author of several books, including A Short of Charleston, Jewish Confederates, and Saving the Jews, FDR and the Holocaust. He has served as chair of the History Commission of the City of Charleston and is a past president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. He lives in Charleston with his wife, Susan, who is also an attorney. Gentlemen, I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you. And First of all, let me welcome everybody to this first of these monthly webcasts. All of us, I think, are living in quarantine, facing the pandemic of the century, all isolated from our friends and family and our work lives. And Robert and I have been having a conversation for about 30 years about history. And that often disagreeing with each other, I might say, on many factors and on many issues. And we thought it might be interesting as a monthly conversation that we would have all our friends around South Carolina and elsewhere join us, eavesdropping on our conversation, and having some of our wonderful guests like Mayor Keyserling and Senator Lurie and Representative Bernstein join us so that we can all connect with each other and engage with each other, notwithstanding the fact that right now we're not able to gather. So our program today, on the first of these monthly discussions, is a subject which has been of great interest to our members. That is South Carolina's very distinctive history of Jewish elected officials. South Carolina, as we will discuss in just a moment, has a truly unique history of Jewish office holding that dates from the earliest days of the colony. And it's not an accident or fluke of history. It's because of some very significant developments, which we will discuss today. After we do a little bit of talk on history, we're going to then greet our guests and engage them in several questions about their service and the service for Senator Lurie and for Mayor Keyserling of their parents who were their second generation elected officials. So first of all, let me just greet Mayor Keyserling. Good afternoon.
Hi, Richard. Good afternoon.
Good to have you here with us. Senator Joe Lurie, good to have you here with us. And Representative Bernstein, good to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Let me first turn to Robert. And Robert, let's talk about what was it about? Why would Jews come to the godforsaken Carolina colony, a wilderness between Virginia and Florida, known for disease, hostile Indians, and hostile Spanish? Why would they come here?
Well, it was a much better place than where they were. And what I think, you know, why did we go from there to here? You know, I think that we are so fortunate to be able to take America for granted that we just don't, and I don't know that we recall that the Jews who came to South Carolina lived very restricted lives. It's true they weren't being persecuted everywhere in Europe, but in Spain and in Portugal, of course, you know, there was the Inquisition, which we all recall, and the Jews escaped to various parts of Europe. But even in those cities in Europe, they were living in ghettos. They were living in restricted parts of the city. They certainly didn't have the right to vote or participate in the government, or really.
And many of them could not participate in business outside the ghetto.
Couldn't follow their trades. They weren't citizens, and so you know there was a big desire for people who were adventurous to get out. So they went to the Caribbean, they went to Brazil, and they came, you know, they tried to come to the New World. And, you know, one of the things I always like to point out in these talks is, you know, Massachusetts was created as a religious experiment, a godly colony. We shall be as a city on a hill. But that didn't include the Jews. So, for example, the Jews were not allowed to live in Massachusetts. But by 1670, when Carolina became a colony, religious toleration was coming into vogue in Great Britain. And so these are people who could come to Carolina, could come to the Caribbean and be able to live as free and equal people, which leads us to the fundamental Constitution of Carolina, Richard. Yes. The noted philosopher John Locke, who's an Enlightenment philosopher and secretary to Lord Shaftesbury, who was one of the Lord Proprietors of Carolina, wrote something called the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina. Now, this document never actually went into legal effect, but it had one key provision which is of great interest to us. It said, and I'm quoting, that there will be liberty of conscience to dissenters, heathens, and Jews. And as I always point out, we might have come third, but at least we were on the list. And what that meant, so by dissenters, they meant Protestant dissenters. They meant people.
How unusual was this fundamental constitution when it was adopted?
As far as I know, it was
created in
unique.
1660.
It was unique at the time. In other words,
No,
people.
No
people
constitution in human history had ever provided
No.
for religious freedom.
No, and this was just, this was just a thought of John Locke and the Enlightenment, and whose patron was able to do it at a time when things in England allowed for religious toleration was the wave of the future. But places like Connecticut, Massachusetts, even Virginia, the Jews really were not welcome. And so Carolina really starts off as a haven for Jewish people.
And not just Jews, other religious dissenters.
Correct. I mean, Charleston had at one time every dissenting church. We say we have the first of the first Baptist churches. And we had, the Baptists were persecuted. The Huguenots came to Charleston. Of course, we still were discriminating against the Catholics because Spain was still the great enemy of the.
But the Unitarians, the Quakers,
right.
all these
Quakers,
groups which
right.
were discriminated in other places were welcome in South Carolina,
so
Carolina Colony.
So South Carolina has to pay for slavery and racism, but on the issue of religious tolerance, it really is at the top of the list.
So this fundamental constitution was the first constitution in human history to provide for religious freedom.
Right.
And then the Jews came. They got it, correct?
Right. They arrived, and they arrived, and everybody says they were Sephardic. Well, most of them were Sephardic, but they were Sephardic and they were Ashkenazi. They were from Holland, they were from England, they were from the Caribbean, they were from Barbados, and many of them spoke Spanish. So what happens is they have a community, and the first communal organization is Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, which is a Sephardic Orthodox synagogue. People tend to think of the temple as being reformed, but of course at the time, the service was in Spanish and in Hebrew. And the names are Sephardic. One of the early prominent citizens, Moses Lindo, who was the surveyor and inspector general of indigo. The reason indigo was such a big crop in South Carolina is the Lindo family were indigo and dye brokers in London. And he's appointed to do these things. And there are people going far back into the colonial period. And of course, most of us know Francis Salvador, and this is such a great story. Here is a young man whose family owns a tremendous tract of land in Greenwood, what is now Greenwood. And
100,000 acres.
100,000 acres. And he's 26 years old. And when the revolution breaks out, he is elected to what was called the Provincial Congress and the first General Assembly of South Carolina. He is literally the first Jew elected to a popular assembly in the history of the Western world. There were no Jews elected to anything in Europe. Jews were not allowed to vote in Great Britain, and they certainly couldn't vote any elsewhere in Europe. And so here you, or in Massachusetts, or in New England. So here you have in South Carolina, the first Jew elected to a popular assembly, served on various committees. He was well liked by Henry Laurens and all the figures of revolutionary South Carolina, and enlisted and was killed by the British and Indian tribes in the Revolutionary War. He's the first.
He's actually the first Jew to die for American liberty.
Right, and there isn't a statue of him anywhere pointing that out. Maybe we ought to think about building one.
Yeah, there's a little historic marker in Washington Park in Charleston. It's the only thing to the first Jew ever elected to public office.
Right.
Let's if we might, let's move to the period after the Revolution and the establishment of the Republic, the establishment of South Carolina in 1790 Constitution, and we start having Francis Salvador is not the only Jew elected to public office. In the turn of the 19th century, there's early 1800s, Jews began getting elected to public office. Meyer Moses is elected from Charleston, to a legislature. You see the image there of Chapman Levy. He is a state senator from Camden, from Kershaw County. There's a state senator, Moses, actually the son of Meyer Moses, who was a Charleston representative, who was elected from Sumter, and MC Mordecai was elected from Charleston. Robert, talk a little bit about who MC Mordecai was.
Yeah, I always find him to be one of the most fascinating people. Moses Cohen Mordecai. Now, it can't get much more Jewish than that. Ben Goldberg always used to say that in the 19th century, they pronounced it Mordecai. But in any event, Moses Cohen Mordecai lives on Meeting Street right next to the federal courthouse. And his house is still there. He was a state senator from Charleston. He owned a steamship company. He was in the same party as Calhoun. He was the state senator from Charleston County. Now,
there was one senator.
One state senator in the antebellum period in the 1840s and 50s. So, and he was president of the Temple. So this is not some guy trying to pass for a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, And so you give that some thought. And his wife is related to the Lyonses, who's his wife's father?
No, his wife's husband is Henry Lyons, the mayor of Columbia.
Mayor of Columbia. So these are people who are very much a part of the political world of their time.
And Chapman Levy was, whose image is up now, was very active in national politics. He was a Van Buren supporter, was a big unionist, and a great lawyer. I called him the Isidore Lurie of the 1830s. And he was quite a character. But it wasn't just these state legislators. There were also mayors and city council members. Henry Lyons, whose image comes up, it was the mayor of Columbia, elected in 1850. His original election as mayor was out of a protest vote because the city had adopted blue laws, and he ran and was elected to city council and eventually became the mayor. But he was Columbia's second Jewish mayor. Mordecai Hendricks de Leon was the first Jewish mayor, was a physician, was the mayor multiple terms in Columbia, and his grave and the grave of family members is in the Hebrew Benevolent Society Cemetery in Columbia. Additionally, Georgetown elected 3 Jewish mayors before the Civil War. Camden had a Jewish mayor. So, Robert, what's going on with all these Jewish elected officials before the Civil War?
Yeah, I tell you, what it shows is that these were people who were successful, who were literate, who were people who were respected in their community, and who I think made a very strong effort to assimilate and be a part of the larger community. So, and I also ascribe it to the fact that the church in South Carolina was ruled with a light hand. In other words, in Massachusetts, the Puritans had a very dogmatic view of religion. One thing we can say for the Anglican Church in South Carolina, like our friends in the Episcopal Church later, they were open. We had Presbyterians, we had Methodists, we had Unitarians, Quakers, and we had Jews. And I think that the whole atmosphere in South Carolina was just more conducive to religious tolerance.
And these Jewish elected officials, from the city councils to the state senators, was this typical of other states in the Union?
It really isn't. Although in the South, I know in Louisiana, when I wrote my history of the Jewish Confederates, the South Carolina Jews, in fact, it's sort of comical. In 1860, Judah Benjamin, who's a poor Jewish boy who grows up on King Street, his father was a member of KKBE and a member of the Reformed Society of Israelites. He went off to Yale, he comes back to Charleston, goes to New Orleans. His cousin, Henry Hyams, and one of the Moises from South Carolina all end up in Louisiana, and Benjamin is the United States Senator, Hyams is the Lieutenant Governor, Moise is a federal judge. And somebody says,
and he's actually he's Speaker of the House at one point.
Yeah, and somebody says we're not only infested with Jews in Louisiana, but a particular type of South Carolinian Jews.
Well, actually, it's Charleston Jews. All of those 3 had grown up in KKBE,
right.
And that was the only other state that was comparable to South Carolina in Jewish office holding was Louisiana. and their most prominent office holders were Charleston Jews.
Right.
Um,
It's really
I mean,
ironic.
it's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I want to
but-
mention somebody else, Philip Phillips. This is just a footnote to history, but here's a guy who's born and raised in Charleston, marries Eugenia Phillips, who's a Civil War character. He was in the legislature from She-Ra, I think, Richard, if I'm right.
Chesterfield County, right?
Yeah, and then he moves to Alabama, where he's elected to Congress. He's a brilliant lawyer. He wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
And he becomes, after the Civil War, he becomes the greatest of the Supreme Court advocates, argued over 400 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was one of the Supreme Court specialists, one of the great lawyers of the 19th century, but another Charleston Jew who grew up in KKVE. Let's talk about Jewish service in the Civil War, because, you know, a lot of people with a modern eye, you know, are understandably put off by Jewish loyalty to the Confederacy, the Jews here, some Jewish slaveholding, a small number in actual slave trading. Talk about the Jewish relationship in South Carolina and in the South.
Well, you know, I think as we all know, you know, Southern Jews were assimilated into the whole white power structure. And so when the war came, you know, they enlisted, and they were proud or anxious to do their part. Of course, you know, the great majority of them by now, remember, in the earlier years, we talked about Sephardic Jews, we talked about, you know, assimilated Jews from London and from Holland. The next wave of Jews who come in the 1830s and 40s are German. And so the Jewish community then becomes very Germanized, and you have all these German names who are popping up. And they're peddlers, shopkeepers, barkeeps, you know, they're not wealthy people. And so, you know, a lot of them enlist. But there were, you know, any number of outstanding Charleston Jews who served in the Confederacy. I mean, the biggest figure to me, other than Judah Benjamin, who I think, you know, Benjamin becomes the Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State of the Confederacy. But Edwin Warren Moise, I think, is a really interesting figure. You know, he's born in Charleston. The Moise family is really a huge family. Moise is Spanish for Moses. And so Moise grows up again at KKB, moves to Columbus, Georgia. He's a real charismatic figure. He raises a company of cavalry. And it was very unusual to find a Jewish cavalry officer. And he raises his own company, which is called the Moise Rangers. As far as I can tell, it's the only Jewish name of a Confederate unit. And Moise becomes very close to Wade Hampton. He serves in Wade Hampton's army. After the war, he becomes a big factor in Reconstruction. And, you know, but
he's elected to statewide office as Adjutant General, and he's the only Jew I think has ever been elected, a practicing Jew who's ever been elected to statewide office in South Carolina.
Yeah, as a practicing Jew, that's correct. We have a lot of interesting Jewish people during Reconstruction, but that's a topic for another program.
Yeah, and so and then after the Civil War, the South is in economic depression. A lot of the Jews leave South Carolina and go to Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, etc. And there's this new wave of Jews who come into South Carolina from Eastern Europe and Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I dare say most of the folks on this Zoom program, those are our descendants, those folks who came in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And before I go to the modern era, Robert, we got to at least talk about Saul Blott.
We do. I mean, there are plenty of people we could talk about. I mean, you know, people don't realize Sam Rittenberg Highway in Charleston is named for Sam Rittenberg, who's a prominent Jewish politician in the early 20th century. And there are all of these people who we're not talking about. But I think Saul Blott Sr. is a good example of a very interesting phenomenon. Now, Saul Blott Sr. Parents were Nathan and Molly Blott, who were Russian immigrants. So I want to, lay to rest this idea that he wasn't actually Jewish. He was actually Jewish, and his parents were actually immigrants.
Judge Blott was a colleague of mine, and he told me his grandparents kept kosher.
Right. I mean, this was not, again, and this is what I find so interesting about it. It's not like people are trying to fool anybody. In other words, I don't think Nathan and Molly Blott living in Blackville, I don't think anybody in Blackville had any doubt about who they were. And no doubt they spoke Yiddish as well as English. And so Saul Blott grows up and becomes a real charismatic trial lawyer and runs for the House and is elected in 1932. He served in World War I in the Army. So he's, I don't know what, he was, I think he was in the artillery. He sort of, does his service in World War I, comes back and is elected to the House in 1932 and serves continuously until 1973. He's the longest serving member of the House of Representatives in American history. He was Speaker of the House. Actually, he was Speaker from 32 to 37, and then again from 57 to 73. And so, and
he's the longest serving Speaker of a House in American history.
Right. And, and he was a person of his time. I mean, he was conservative, and he's, look, his politics are not our politics, but the fact of the matter is, it's just an interesting life that the son of Jewish immigrants could become the Speaker of the House and a powerful member of the Barnwell Ring, which controlled South Carolina politics for all those years.
Yeah, and let me just say, and Joel will remember this, that when his dad was elected in 1964, he had a somewhat uncomfortable relationship with the Speaker because his dad was part of this Young Turks group that was challenging the old guard, which was very much Speaker Bly, right, Joel?
Absolutely. In fact, that you may recall, Richard, one of the first things Dad did was he challenged the existing House protocol for only recognizing white school children up in the gallery, but not school children of color. And that led to one of many confrontations with Speaker Bly.
Yeah, so as in many of these stories of politics in South Carolina, Jews ended up on both sides of a lot of issues. Let's move on to the modern era, and we've mentioned a few of these names, and we'll talk about them more. Of course, Senator Isidore Lurie was a legendary figure, first elected in 1964 to the House. He was then later elected to the Senate, and he became Senate Majority Leader. He was, I think, by all accounts, one of the most important South Carolina political figures of his generation. He served, Joel, into when? What year did he?
92. He served for 28 years, Richard.
Yeah, and then Joel was elected about a decade later to the Senate.
6 years later. 6 years.
6
later.
years. Okay, and served for 3 terms in the Senate. Retired in the last couple of years. Harriet Kaiserling was a very important member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. Was really the mother of the South Carolina environmental movement. She's an incredibly important person and a key part of this Young Turks revolution. You see a couple of them there, Dick Riley and Nick Theodore with Representative Kaiserling. She was a truly visionary leader, and her book on her experiences in South Carolina House is really a classic. I know that Beth Bernstein was saying before we started that as a young House member, that she that was one of the books she went to for inspiration about the role that a progressive woman could play in the legislature. Another very important figure is Mayor Max Heller of Greenville. Max was a refugee of Germany. He and his wife both. They came to Greenville penniless. He bought the textile mill he started working in, and was a very wealthy man. In his early 50s, sold his business and became the mayor of Greenville for multiple terms. And downtown Greenville is the vision of Max Heller. Many people who go to Greenville and just amazed with this downtown revitalization downtown. really, recognize it. And I believe the convention center there is named for Max. And that's a wonderful picture of he and Trudy, who were early and very active members of the Jewish Historical Society. Just throwing other names, Irene Rudnick from Aiken was a long-term member of the House and a lawyer from Aiken. Senator Hyman Rubin from Richland County, Arnie Goodstein from Charleston County, many other representatives. A number of them are pictured here of state and elected officials and mayors. And that's a wonderful picture by Bill Aaron that was in Dale Rosengarten's wonderful exhibit, Portion of the People, that just shows these modern elected officials. Let me, if I might, turn to Joe Lurie. And Joe, talk to me a little bit about your dad and what sort of brought him to public service.
So Richard, thank you, and Robert and Richard, thank y'all. I know that Dad would be very proud of both of you for hosting this this meeting tonight. As you know, Richard, you and him work so closely to put this whole Jewish Historical Society from a concept into reality. Dad got very interested in politics as a young boy growing up in Dorchester County in St. George, South Carolina. And you may recall, Richard, his father, my grandfather, Lewis Lurie, and Senator J.D. Parler were very close. And my grandfather would call on Parler for many things. And Grandpa was the merchant in town that I think there was maybe one other Jewish family, but they were very good friends. And my father was very excited to get involved. He started getting involved at a very young age for Senator Parler. Just to show you Dorchester County politics, a friend of mine who worked at the State House, his family owned the, I think it was the St. George Golden Record or Golden Eagle, the newspaper. And he has in his office, November of 1960, there was this big election between Frank Jessup, the sheriff, and Senator Parler. And he has on his wall a framed newspaper from the front page. And right across this thing, this was like the Hatfields and the McCoys, it says Jessup beats Parler. And that was Parler's last time in office. And at the very bottom, if you look very closely, you'd see a little headline that says Kennedy beats Nixon. So that's all that anybody cared about. But, so he grew up and just always had a passion for public service and got very involved. He was, I think, one of the first Jewish presidents of the student body. You may recall, Richard, Carol Glenn was his campaign manager, and Carol got, introduced Dad to all the different fraternities and sororities, and just, had a real passion for wanting to serve in public. And Dad always had, he, as you know, he was a great bridge early in his career and really to the very end in trying to build relationships between the African-American community and the white community. And he really helped pave the way with so many others in the mid-60s with I.D. Quincy Newman and James Felder and so many others in sort of paving the way, Hyman Rubin, for civil discourse in South Carolina with regard to race relations. So he always just had a passion for getting involved.
And tell me how that impacted in terms of your own desire for public office.
Well, first of all, I did make a note because one of you, I don't know if Richard, it was you or Robert, but y'all were talking about, Jews coming to this country with very little in their pocket. Max Heller, as you know, came with the clothes on his back, and love everything you said about Mayor Heller. And if you visit Greenville, you can see they actually have a couple of statues in an exhibit right at the beginning of the walk down into the park. But he believed in the American dream, Richard. We used to joke because he used to give that speech about believing in the American dream. He would talk a lot about his parents who came here with nothing, and it was critically important that he and his 5 siblings all went to college. They all became accomplished professionals in their own field. My Uncle Herbert, I remember when he went to Duke Medical School, we went to Duke undergrad. At that time, they had a quota for Jewish people, and we were worried. I wouldn't even allow them. They were worried that he might not even get in. So, Dad instilled from his career I think as all of us as Jews have always been compelled to think and lead on issues of fairness, on social justice, on equality. And I think that, I think it comes from everything we've learned in Sunday school about the Jews being slaves in Egypt, to what we were taught about the Holocaust, to seeing our parents, Richard, your mom and dad, my parents, you know, leading in the civil rights movement. And I think that just sort of drives us as Jews as to why we're always take such a leadership role in issues of social justice and progress and racial equality. And it had a profound impact on me. And I mean, I grew up going to African-American churches with my father, and could tell you many a funny story about some of my experiences there. I learned on a Sunday afternoon what communion was, and Dad kind of slapped my hand because I asked for another cracker. But
that's great. Robert, you want to chat with Billy about his mom's service?
Billy,
Robert.
Harriet was bigger than life.
Good.
I think that a lot of people on this broadcast really don't know, maybe don't know about your mom. Can you give us a history and a background?
I can, Robert, but you know, over the years, I think we've done this program. This will be the third time, and we always talk about Harriet. And so I'm happy and proud to talk about Harriet. But I think that, you know, Harriet was a transplant. Harriet grew up, was educated in New York, had a career in New York, and anticipated going back to New York. It was by fluke that she was here. She was miserable here. She was isolated here. She didn't have friends here. In the morning, she'd play four-handed piano with one friend. In the afternoon, she'd play Scrabble with another. And it was only after the children were gone that she, who still owned an interest in an apartment in New York, had to decide whether she was going to split her time between here and there, and decided she was going to stay here and make it better. You know, I've been working on a book that's about finished, and I've been thinking about this, but I've gone deeper than Harriet, and I've really gone back to the Kaiserlings. I see my cousin Harry was on here a little while ago. And while I don't want to divert from Harriet, I think that her transition here was very much influenced by the moral compass that came from my grandfather in 1888, when as a teenager he arrived in Beaufort. Because when he got to the running from the Tsar, he got to the Lower East Side and he wanted to be a farmer. And he figured out pretty quickly you couldn't do that in the Lower East Side of New York. So he peddled his way here. But here in the early 1900s, he's the first member of the board of Penn School, which was created in Reconstruction, started by the Unitarians and the Quakers support and the abolitionists. But he was literally the first person from Beaufort to be on that board. During Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, because Reconstruction lasted longer and started earlier and lasted longer in Beaufort probably than any place else. So the National Park Service is about almost 1900. But anyway, he organized buying and selling cooperatives for the small farmers, the large farmers, the black farmers, the white farmers, because he said we got the best cotton and then it was the best vegetables in the world. Why we compete against ourselves? Why don't we compete together? He went on, and in the storm of 1893, which devastated Beaufort, Clara Barton came with the American Red Cross, and the town fathers said, you don't need to go to the islands to check on our people. So he took one of the boats of the empire that he and his partners built, and took them at night, and they spent a day looking on the island. So he was always swimming a little bit upstream. And then at one point served as mayor pro tem of Beaufort, which very few people know. And I didn't know until recently. But then I look at his two sons. Though they were never elected, if you think about his son Leon, the oldest, who after Columbia, where he studied economics and Harvard Law School, he went back to Columbia, but he was drafted from out of the PhD program to work with Rexford Guy Tegwell and became Senator Wagner's principal assistant. The Labor Relations Act, the Housing Act, the Agricultural Act. A great story, because my grandfather was a farmer, is when Jerome Frank was appointed the Secretary of Agriculture, the New York Jew, they suggested Leon talk to him and to be general counsel, and he went to see him and counsel, and he said to Leon, he said, what does a Columbia graduate and a Harvard lawyer know about agriculture? And Leon looked at him and said, I know Pitchfork Ben Tillman, at which time Frank said, you're hired. Because no relationship whatsoever. And Pitchfork Ben Tillman had no interest whatsoever in Jerome Frank, a New York Jew. But anyway, he went on, he wrote an essay. The Full Employment Act of 46 was based on this essay. He was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and it was actually created as a result of his essay, the Employment Act. And then there was my father, who, though was never elected to office, did really transition medicine in the South Carolina Lowcountry, because his whole client base was people who would not have health care if they didn't have it. And he led into, in his later years, the creation of community health centers and working to build and take health care and look at it in terms of housing, potable drinking water, sewer. So, you know, in this book, I've been sort of, it's about the development of a person's moral compass and the people around them. I have to, I'll talk about Harriet, but I have to go back, because I think that her transition here was a transition between the New York Jew and this guy who just totally felt this dedication to the freedom he had when he came here and what he was able to accomplish in a very, very short period of time.
Billy, Billy, let me ask you this. You come from this, I mean, the Kaiserling family, and your dad, of course, was beloved as serving the poorest of Beaufort, black and white.
Mhm.
I remember at his eulogy at his funeral, Pat Conroy delivered it and talked about the role that your dad had played. So you came from this incredible family of service, both in medicine and in public elected officials. How has that influenced you as the now, what is it, 3-term mayor of Beaufort?
Mhm. You know, I served 2 terms in the House, and I hated Columbia, not the city. I hated the House. Joel, I'm sorry, but
Hey, I hated the House too. That's why I went to the Senate.
I was elected as a Democrat, and Judge Gerg will remember that we sued when under reapportionment because my district had been totally changed, and I ran as a petition candidate when David Wilkins said, you know, you can be here forever if you switch parties. And I said, who the hell wants to be here forever? And so after a term as a sort of an independent, I decided that I'd really rather come home and do something that I felt where the rubber hits the road, and got involved in local government.
Hey, Billy, didn't you really say who the hell wants to be a Republican?
You know, at that point, I felt almost the same about the Black Caucus and the Democrats.
Yeah.
I mean, reapportionment is just such an ugly, unfair, unjust, stupid process.
It is. It's
And
terrible.
I
Yeah,
just
but-
was furious at everybody.
Let me just quickly just go to Beth, since they're bad-mouthing the House. As our only Jewish elected House member these days, we have here a picture of your mom, which we just got to mention, because again, not an elected official, but the first woman president of Beth Shalom and a real community go-getter in Columbia. How did your parents influence you in growing up about public service?
You know, that's a great question, because I do attribute a lot of my service to my parents and the values that they instilled in me, and particularly my mother, for being an independent, strong woman. I mean, she was born and raised in New Jersey, and then she came to Columbia in 1961 when she married Daddy. And Daddy was, from here and raised here. And I think Columbia was a little bit of a shock, probably like Mrs. Kaiserling a little bit, but she embraced it. And, Mom got involved in the community, and particularly the Jewish community. But in 1967, she was president of the League of Women Voters. And I'm not so certain how many Jewish women were, involved in in the League of Women Voters, but she was president. She had 3 children. She was about to have another child before my brother, which was my brother. So she had to cut her term short. But I think the role model that Mom had for me in the service, and particularly when she served as the first female president of Beth Shalom. And those of you from Columbia, I was born and raised here in Columbia, and those who were in Columbia for a long time probably understand. I mean, there was a lot of resistance to having, because we grew up in the conservative synagogue at Beth Shalom, there was a lot of resistance to have a woman take that kind of role in the religious perspective. But I also think a little bit how women were viewed then too. So when Mom sat on the bema for the very first time, a lot of people, including my uncle Henry Hammer, walked out of the synagogue. And while I was very young, that was in the 1970s. I was born in 1969. So I mean, I was very young. I still kind of remember though the impact and how my aunt was upset, and a lot of people who were colleagues of my father were upset. But my mom knew she was doing the right thing, and I really think she led a way for a lot of women in our community. And with that, and she raised all 6 kids, and everything that I do, I think, is a reflection on my parents. And so I'm very careful in that. I always try to do the right thing. We're all flawed, and I'm not sure if I always do the right thing, but I have a moral compass and I want to do the right thing. And I attribute that to Mom and Dad. My dad was a very hard worker. He was significantly older. I saw Mrs. Kaiserling was born in 1922. That's when Daddy was born. And so he came from a very strong religious background and work ethic. And those qualities, I think I wanted to be able to give back to the community. But I'll tell you, when I decided to run for office as a female, and a female with the last name Bernstein, I never thought that it would be something that would be in my future. And as a woman, someone really had to suggest that I run for office, and I almost laughed it off. And then I really started doing some research, and that's when I went to Senator Joel Lurie, who's like my big brother, and absolutely, because he and my older brother who was killed grew up together. And Joel was really one of my closest friends and confidants, and really whom I aspire to serve. But I really sat down with Joel and other elected members and really tried to get a level of understanding what it would be to serve and how it would benefit my community to serve. And that's why I decided to run. So I ran in 2012, beat the incumbent. I am a Democrat. We have those same issues that Billy will probably be dealing with. This is, I've never been through a redistricting, but I will be dealing with that next year, and I'll be very cognizant on making sure that all parties are hopefully going to be represented. And I know I'm talking about a lot of subjects, but
No, but Beth, here's something sort of interesting. We've talked about how these Jewish elected officials date from the earliest days of South Carolina, and these the non-Jewish non-Jewish neighbors are electing Jews to public office. And I think particularly the area where you live in northeastern Richland County has had a Jewish school board member, Jewish school board members, county council members, two state senators, and yourself, a House member, and Joel Lurie before you. What's going on in northeast Richland County with all these Jewish elected officials?
Well, that's interesting. And I think it's a tribute to our community. You grew up here within the House district, and Joel served in the House, then the Senate. So he actually served for 18 years. I think you might have said 3 terms, but I mean, he was up there a long time. And he served well. And as a Jewish member who was before me, I think he made inroads, Senator Lurie before, you know, and Senator Rubin obviously also. But I think because we have Beth Shalom, Tree of Life, and now we have Chabad that resides within my House district and broaden that to Joel's Senate district, I think we've assimilated in this community, and people look to the members of our congregation as people who have given back to the community and have really made a difference. And, you know, that's what I attribute it to. And I think we have a community that embraces it, which is surprising. Like I said, with the last name Bernstein, I kept my maiden name. It was really surprising that I could actually hold public office.
Why don't we, Rachel, why don't we see if there got some questions that you may have received, and let's see if we might continue the discussion with our audience.
I'll speak up at this point for Rachel, because she's been doing a lot of the background for us. One of the questions, especially to Joel and Beth and to Billy, is, have any of you experienced anti-Semitism as your role as an elected official? And if so, how were you able to answer or work around that? Beth, why don't we just...
Good. Beth, go ahead.
Go ahead, Beth.
Well, you know, I come in there, I feel like I'm a Democrat, I'm a female, and I'm Jewish. So I'm already coming in at a disadvantage. It really is. And believe it or not, the Republican caucus in the House, and probably the Senate, but particularly the House, I mean, we were the first state to enact anti-BDS legislation. We've had, you know, I haven't felt anti-Semitism serving in office, really. Honestly, I haven't, except when I want to, like, I'm working on hate crime legislation. And when people don't understand why it's important to have hate crime legislation, I have to explain my Jewish heritage for me and the broader reasons why. It's not that it's anti-Semitism. It's just they don't understand the faith. And I don't want to say ignorance. It's just like Joel and I were talking about. I mean, a senator didn't even know, can I say that, Joel? That there were even Jews in South Carolina. He thought they were all in New York. I mean, and this is a senator from the upstate. I mean, so,
he was a very intellectually challenged senator, I might add.
Yeah, he also called women the lesser meat.
Yeah,
Rib meat.
yeah.
Lesser cut of meat.
Lesser cut of meat. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I hope he didn't live in the Jews' land of South Carolina. That was the 100,000 acres that the Salvadors owned. He might be living on Jewish land.
I'm going to work on trying to get a statue when we talk about replacing statues here at Tubman, but actually to have one of I had no idea that little trivia, that we have the first elected Jew in the Western world in South Carolina. That's amazing to me. Yeah. That makes me proud of South Carolina, honestly.
Right, exactly. See, I think the point here is people are always looking for the South, you know, what is wrong, anti-Semitism and all. And I think one of the things that Richard and I sort of like about this topic is you know, it's just counterintuitive. In other words, the South is not, the South has its faults and does have anti-Semitism, and we're not glossing over it. But what we're saying is, but there is another tradition, and the history shows that. So I just think that's very, very important. Billy, you must have run into some anti-Semitism at some point. Never in your life.
No, the only time.
Joel?
No, I mean, I really not. I didn't. You know, the closest I came to anti-Semitism was when my father, who refused for 50 years to pay for a Paul Harris fellowship because he didn't believe you paid $1,000 for an honor. When he retired, the club gave him one, and he bought two the next week, one for me and one to honor his father, who had been blackballed from the club. Personally, I really didn't. I would say to Beth that, and Richard would know this, and Joe would know this, that when Mother went there, I think there were about 6 women, 1976, in the house, and 3 of them were Jewish. Sylvia Dreyfus, Irene Rudnick, and Mother. And I think there was one other since then.
Well, you know, the only real story about anti-Semitism that I know in politics is the Max Heller story, which of course is well known, and maybe Joel can address that story. That was the Atwater situation.
Sure. In fact, Robert, a friend of mine just gave me I'm going on vacation the week after next, and I'm taking the Lee Atwater book with me. It's Bad Boy. It's the one that, you know, has him standing with his gym shorts, you know, standing there in his boxers. Real briefly, because a couple things. Everybody knows that the story of Max Heller, when Max was the mayor of Greenville and was running for Congress against a South Carolina state senator by the name of Carol Campbell. And, you know, Max was actually leading the race. And Richard, I'm going to test your trivia here. But about a month before the election, there was a poll done, and the poll asked, would you vote for a non-native American who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ? And there was just enough, a slither of people in the upstate that would say no. And so emerges this third candidate in the race. Anybody remember his name? Richard?
I don't remember his name.
Who is Don Sprouse? So a guy by the name of Don Sprouse emerged.
And Carol Campbell had nothing to do with that, right?
Allegedly, he had nothing
Right, you
to do
had to
with
pay like $3,000 filing fee or something.
Yeah.
And Mr. Sprouse didn't have $3,000 to his name.
As history would have it, Marvin Chernoff, may he rest in peace, as the story is told, was on an airplane flight, right, Rachel, with Atwater, and he admitted to it. And I want to say, and I could be wrong, Jack Bass, I got a historian here, so I don't want to misstate anything, but I think Atwater ultimately apologized for that in his final days. Did he not, Robert?
He did. Yeah, that was one of it. Yeah, he did. He apologized on his deathbed.
Yeah. So real quickly, have I ever experienced any? I think the first time I ever experienced anti-Semitism was as a 5th grader campaigning for my father when he was running for the Senate. And I'll never forget. I mean, I learned door to door, and all the Bernsteins and Lurie children would go door to door for Senator Isidore Lurie. But there's a nice elderly man just rocking in a rocking chair, and I walk up to the porch and I say, "Excuse me," and I hand him a flyer, and I said, "I'd appreciate if you'd vote for my dad, Isidore Lurie." And he looked me dead in the eye, and here I'm 5th grade. So what is that, about 12? And he says, "I wouldn't vote for that Jew if he was the last man on earth." And I was just speechless, just speechless. And I remember just saying, "Well, I'm sorry, I don't know what I said." I walked down the steps. Of course, later on, my mom picked us all up because we had spread out, and I went home and told my dad about it. And he got in the car, and we rode around that neighborhood to try to figure out what house it was. I think for me, I've had innuendos in my campaigns, and my 2004 Senate race, which was a very, very competitive race. Senator Warren Gazet was retiring. There hadn't been a Democrat in that seat since Senator McDonald lost the seat in '84. And it had shifted very Republican. I was running against a very very conservative, very sort of Christian right opponent. Mark Sanford was very much involved in my race. And I would get calls from constituents that said that my opponent would go into their home and say, "Yeah, Joel's a great guy, but he's not like us. He doesn't believe in Jesus." And those things would happen. I think from a public policy standpoint, Robert and Richard, Beth and I were talking about this earlier. When we were debating the exceptional needs scholarship on the floor of the Senate, this was a bill that now allows kids with special needs, they can apply for a scholarship within a certain school and leave the public school setting and perhaps get a scholarship to go to a private school. The language was originally written that even these private religious schools could accept only those kids that subscribe to that same faith. And I remember standing up on the Senate floor about 9 o'clock during the middle of the budget And I said, are you telling me that if a Jewish kid from Greenville wants to take a scholarship and go to an Episcopal school, he'll be denied or she'll be denied? And the sponsor of the amendment said, well, I guess I am. And I responded, well, we're going to be here all night tonight because this will never pass as long as I can stand, breathe, and speak. And he came over, and like we typically do in the Senate, we worked it out. They changed the wording of it. But really, not so much. I don't think I ever, those are a couple of few instances. But for whatever reason, for a state that does not have a great history on race relations, we have found that electing Jewish public servants we've had a lot of great success with that. And by the way, don't let Beth Bernstein kid you. She is the only Democratic subcommittee chair of the Judiciary Committee. And if we get a hate crimes bill next year, which I believe we stand a really good chance now that Georgia has passed theirs, it'll be because Beth is able to bridge sort of the gap between the Democrats, particularly the African-American Democrats, and the conservatives and the House leadership. So I'm very proud of the work she's done.
Rachel, you got other questions?
I think
Or,
at
Lily?
this point, Richard, I think what we're going to do at this point, on this upbeat note about what's going to happen next year in the state legislature with Beth, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this fabulous program, especially Richard and Robert, for starting us off great, and to Beth, Billy, and Joel for participating and giving us your input from your experiences. I want to announce to everybody that we are going to have another one of these kinds of meetings in August, the Sunday conversations with the judge and with Robert. It will be on August the 30th at 5:30. And the topic is the geography of South Carolina's synagogues, with two special guests, Dr. Gary Zola from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, and Dr. Sam Gruber, architectural historian and historic preservationist from Syracuse, New York. Please, everyone, sign up for our newsletter, jhssc.org, and follow us on Facebook. And
Lily,
all
can I
of-
say one thing just so folks can appreciate? We find it fascinating, and I know Dale Rosengarten has done a wonderful job of documenting the history of these synagogues, both in the major cities of South Carolina and in small towns. And we're going to talk about all those synagogues, not just KKBE and Charleston and the other synagogues in Charleston and then in Columbia, but synagogues in places like Aiken and Anderson and Georgetown and Beaufort and other places, Sumter. And we're going to talk about that and hopefully show great images of these synagogues, many which are quite beautiful, and to talk about this history of Jewish life in these small towns. So I want to make sure everyone joins us for that.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. So everyone be safe, take care, and we hope to see you again 30th of August.
Good job.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. That was great.